Lu Wen had never been one for excitement. Life, to him, was a series of well-rehearsed routines: wake up, go to work, grab a quick lunch, stare blankly at his computer screen until the clock mercifully ticked down to 5 p.m. He lived in a small apartment that smelled faintly of old takeout containers, and he spent his evenings scrolling through his phone, catching up on the latest gossip or mindlessly watching videos that offered more distractions than answers. If there was one thing Lu Wen had mastered, it was the art of blending into the background. One Tuesday afternoon, as he wandered the city streets with no particular destination in mind, Lu Wen found himself stepping into a quaint, cluttered antique shop tucked between two towering office buildings. The place smelled like old wood and dust, with shelves overflowing with objects that appeared more like junk than treasure. He had no real reason for entering. It was just one of those spontaneous, unexplainable decisions that life sometimes offers. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with wild gray hair and thick glasses, looked up as he walked in. Her expression was unreadable, though she did give him a faint smile. There was something unsettling about her, but Lu Wen shrugged it off. He had never been superstitious. He wandered aimlessly through the aisles, occasionally glancing at trinkets that seemed irrelevant to his life. That's when he saw it, an old mirror. It was framed in intricate, gold-edged carvings, its surface cloudy with age. At first, Lu Wen thought little of it. After all, mirrors were hardly uncommon in a place like this. But as his gaze lingered, he felt an odd pull. The mirror wasn't just dusty. It was alive in a way he couldn't explain. Something about it spoke to him, like a whisper from another world. His fingers brushed against the glass, and the feeling intensified, sending a jolt of unease straight through him. The old woman appeared beside him, her movements unnervingly swift. "You should not touch it," she warned, her voice low and cracked. Lu Wen's eyes darted to her face, surprised by the sudden appearance. "Why not?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual indifference. "The mirror," she said cryptically, "does not show what you expect. What you see, you cannot return from." Lu Wen laughed, half amused, half unsettled. "It's just a mirror, isn't it? A little dusty, maybe. I'm sure it's nothing more than an antique." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Lu Wen thought he saw something like fear flicker across her features. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by an eerie calm. She didn't say another word, but her gaze lingered on him, heavy with warning. Shrugging off the strange encounter, Lu Wen paid for the mirror and left the shop. The strange encounter and the woman's warning gnawed at him for the rest of the evening, but life, as always, went on. He didn't think much more about it. That night, as Lu Wen sat on his worn-out couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, something inside him urged him to look at the mirror. It was placed on a small table by the window, catching the dim light of the street lamp outside. For reasons he couldn't quite understand, he felt compelled to approach it. The surface of the mirror seemed different now, as though the reflection it held wasn't entirely his. He stared at himself, his average, unremarkable face, the baggy eyes from late nights at the office, the stubble that he had never bothered to shave. But something felt off. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. His reflection blinked at him. Lu Wen blinked. The reflection blinked again. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped back, his heartbeat quickening, and his mind racing. But before he could process what was happening, he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, like something was yanking at him from within. He stumbled back, feeling the room spin, and then, blackness. When Lu Wen awoke, he was not in his apartment anymore. The surroundings were unfamiliar. He was in a lavishly decorated bedroom, the walls lined with expensive-looking art and the scent of fresh flowers lingering in the air. His hands trembled as he reached up to his face, his fingers brushing against unfamiliar features. The man staring back at him from the mirror wasn't Lu Wen. It was someone else entirely, a stranger. A tall, well-groomed man in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp suit. His face was sharp, confident, even arrogant, with dark eyes that looked as though they belonged to someone who was used to being in charge. Lu Wen's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice coming out in a deeper tone than he was used to. It was definitely not his own voice. Panic rose in his chest as he stumbled to his feet. He turned toward the room, scanning his surroundings, only to be greeted by a team of employees who barged into the room, calling him Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't Lu Wen anymore. Somehow, he had swapped bodies with someone named Chen Chang, a name he recognized now that his mind was slowly processing the situation. Chen Chang was a CEO, one of the most powerful figures in the city's tech industry. Before he could begin to comprehend the magnitude of his situation, a sleek, expensive phone rang on the nightstand. Without thinking, he picked it up, his fingers moving almost instinctively. "Mr. Chen, the board meeting is scheduled in 30 minutes. Shall we bring your coffee up?" a voice on the other end of the line asked, polite and deferential. Lu Wen's mind was reeling. He wasn't ready for this sudden shift in power and wealth. But something told him he had no choice. He had to play along, at least for now. He needed to figure out how to get back to his old life, or if that was even possible. For the next few days, Lu Wen lived in a haze of confusion. He attended meetings, signed documents, and ate meals with people he didn't know, all while wearing the body of a man who seemed to have it all. Power. Respect. Wealth. The lifestyle was intoxicating. Every command he issued was obeyed without question. Every door he walked through seemed to open just a little wider, but with each passing day, Lu Wen grew more unsettled. The voice was always there, quiet, persistent, echoing in the back of his mind. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But it wasn't. There was someone else in his head. Someone who knew everything about this life, someone who seemed to be him, but wasn't. It was the voice of Chen Chang. At first, it was faint, a whisper that barely registered. But as time passed, the voice grew louder, more insistent. And then, one evening, when Lu Wen was alone in the office, "It happened, help me," came the voice, clear and desperate. Lu Wen froze. His heart pounded in his chest. Who is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me," the voice replied. "Chen Chang. I'm trapped. You have to get me out." Lu Wen's breath hitched. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it was. Somehow, in some twisted turn of fate, Lu Wen had not only taken over Chen Chang's body, but had also inherited a piece of his consciousness. And that consciousness was trapped within his own mind, unable to escape. The realization hit Lu Wen with full force. He wasn't just living someone else's life, he was imprisoned in it. Lu Wen sat at the large mahogany desk in what had once been Chen Chang's office, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. The voice echoed again in his mind, faint but undeniable. "Help me." He leaned back in the plush chair, his mind racing. The soft hum of the city below, the distant chatter of the office outside, all felt like they belonged to someone else. Everything about his life now felt alien, like he was pretending to be someone else. And yet, the worst part of it all was the voice that insisted it was his, Chen Chang's, true self, still trapped somewhere inside this luxurious prison. The realization had hit him hard, but it wasn't the only thing gnawing at him. He had, for all intents and purposes, usurped Chen Chang's life. Was that even possible? Could he ever give it back? How long would it take before his own identity was swallowed whole by this foreign man's memories and desires? Chen Chang, Lu Wen whispered under his breath. The name echoed like a foreign tongue on his lips, too smooth and confident to belong to him. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door broke his reverie. It was too polite, too professional. The voice on the other side, muffled by the thick oak, called, "Mr. Chen, the board meeting is starting in 10 minutes. Should we bring your coffee?" Lu Wen blinked, momentarily stunned by the ease with which this life was falling into place. This was Chen Chang's life, he was the center of it, the one in control. He wanted to shout, to scream that he didn't belong here, that he was an imposter, but all that escaped him was a small, strangled sigh. "Just bring it up," he managed to say, the voice sounding less like his own and more like the confident baritone of Chen Chang. The door opened a moment later, and a young assistant in a sharp suit entered, holding a tray of coffee. Lu Wen nodded at her as she placed it on the desk, avoiding his gaze, as though he were too important to be looked at directly. "Thank you," Lu Wen said, though the words felt strange in his mouth. She nodded and quickly retreated, leaving him alone again. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic tapping of the coffee spoon on the porcelain cup. His reflection in the glass seemed to taunt him, as though the man in the mirror was not the person who'd been wearing this skin for only a few days. He wasn't Lu Wen anymore. He was Chen Chang, a man whose life was already in motion before his soul had even entered the picture, and yet, somewhere deep inside him, a faint thread of something real lingered. His true self, Lu Wen, fought to be seen, but the longer he stayed in this body, the more distant it seemed. The memories, the knowledge, the instincts of this powerful man, they were starting to feel like they belonged to him, but the voice, Chen Chang's voice, wouldn't stop. It was there in every quiet moment, growing louder, more desperate, each time Lu Wen tried to push it away. "Help me," the voice pleaded again, more insistent than before. "I can't take it anymore. You're the only one who can save me." Lu Wen gritted his teeth. He tried to focus, tried to ignore it, but it was like a weight pressing against his temples. He pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to make sense of the situation, but the voice was growing louder, filling every crevice of his mind. "You don't understand," the voice said, a tremor of panic seeping through the words. "I'm still here. I'm trapped in here, in this body, and I can't get out. You've got to help me. Please." His pulse quickened, and for a moment, Lu Wen thought he might break. This was madness, a nightmare with no way out. Was he hallucinating? Was he losing his mind? But the voice was too real, too vivid to ignore. "Why?" Lu Wen muttered aloud, his voice wavering. "Why me? Why are you talking to me?" "Because I can feel you. I can feel you in my head." Chen Chang's voice was thick with frustration. "I'm not the man you think I am. I never wanted this." Lu Wen's heart pounded. What was this? Some kind of twisted joke? But the longer he listened, the more real it became. The memories flooding his mind, Chen Chang's life, his ambitions, his fears, his regrets, were all too vivid. It was as though Lu Wen was becoming Chen Chang, piece by piece. He was starting to understand the man's life in ways that seemed unnatural. The more he gave in to this body, the more Chen Chang's consciousness seemed to bleed into his own. "I didn't mean for this to happen," the voice continued, "but you don't know what it's like in here. I can't breathe. I can't think. My soul is suffocating. Help me." Lu Wen swallowed hard. The realization hit him again, this wasn't just a body swap. This was something darker, something worse. Chen Chang's soul was still trapped in the labyrinth of his own mind, desperate for release. But if Lu Wen helped him, would that mean he had to give up this life, the one he was growing accustomed to? The thought unsettled him. Power. Control. Luxury. They were intoxicating, like a drug. Lu Wen had never known such a life. He'd spent his years chasing after nothing, settling for mediocrity, but now he could have everything. Everything he'd ever dreamed of. But it came at a price. "If I help you," Lu Wen asked, his voice low, "what happens to me? What happens to my soul? Will I be trapped in this body forever?" There was a long silence, the kind that made Lu Wen's breath catch in his throat. "I don't know," the voice replied, hesitant and trembling. "But I can't stay in here. If you leave me in here, I'll die. My mind will shatter. I'll lose everything." Lu Wen's stomach twisted. How could he possibly help? He was a nobody, an insignificant cog in the wheel of this man's existence. He had no right to take over another life. But what choice did he have? The mirror had trapped him in this nightmare, and now the man whose body he'd stolen was begging him to fix it. "I need to get back," Lu Wen muttered, his mind still spinning. "I need to get back to my life." "You will," Chen Chang's voice promised. "But not unless you free me. We both can be free. You don't belong here either. You're not me, you're trapped in my prison just like I am. Help me, and I'll help you." Lu Wen closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the words, the crushing realization that his freedom was tied to someone else's suffering. But that didn't change the fact that he had no idea how to make this right. The mirror was his only connection to his past, to his real life, but it had become clear that its power was more dangerous than he could have imagined. He had to find a way out. For himself. For both of them, the next few days passed in a blur. Lu Wen threw himself into the role of Chen Chang, outwardly pretending to be the CEO while privately fighting to retain whatever part of his old self remained. He met with business partners, smiled for the cameras at press conferences, and signed off on company deals he barely understood. But through it all, the voice of Chen Chang never stopped, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone in this body. "Help me," the voice would whisper during meetings, its desperation growing with each passing hour. "Please." The pressure mounted. The guilt. The fear. The power. The desire to keep it all, but he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He needed to make a choice. Lu Wen stood in front of the mirror again. This time, there was no hesitation. He had to confront it, confront the man whose body he had been living in for the past several days. The reflection that stared back at him was the same as always, tall, composed, and powerful. A man with sharp features, impeccable grooming, and an air of unshakable confidence. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be. He was a ghost in this body, an imposter trapped in someone else's life. "Chen Chang," Lu Wen said softly, his voice betraying the sense of growing desperation that had taken root inside him. "I can't keep doing this. I need to find a way back." He reached out to touch the mirror, his hand trembling. The glass was cool to the touch, just as it had been the first time he'd made contact with it. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like it was aware of him. The weight of his decision pressed down on his chest, a constant ache. Chen Chang's voice, once pleading, was now quieter, more resigned. "You have to." "We both do," the voice said, barely a whisper in his mind. Lu Wen let out a frustrated sigh and turned away. He couldn't keep pretending he was someone he wasn't. The luxury, the power, it was all too much. It wasn't real. It wasn't him. But even as he thought that, he knew it wasn't true. The longer he stayed in this body, the more of Chen Chang's memories had settled into his mind, like pieces of a puzzle clicking together. He had never been a man of ambition, of great wealth or influence. But now, with Chen Chang's life so firmly entrenched in his, Lu Wen found himself craving things he hadn't even considered before. The allure of wealth. The respect. The fear that came with being in charge, and yet, there was the voice. Still, whispering. "I can't breathe in here. Please help me. I'm losing myself. I'll disappear. If you leave me, I'll be nothing but a ghost." Lu Wen clenched his fists at his sides. This was madness. He was suffocating in someone else's skin, trapped in a body that wasn't his. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The mirror, the body, the voice, they were all part of a tangled mess he couldn't unravel. The longer he stayed here, the more it felt like the choice was being made for him. Every day, he was slipping further into Chen Chang's life, and his own sense of self was beginning to fray at the edges. He ran his fingers through his hair, glancing at the door. Soon, the board members would be arriving, expecting the CEO to lead the meeting, to make decisions that would determine the future of the company. And Lu Wen, no, not Lu Wen anymore, Chen Chang, or whatever part of him was still here, had to play the part. He had no choice. The man in the mirror was waiting for him to fulfill the role that had been laid out for him long before Lu Wen ever set foot in this body. The door to the office opened, and a well-dressed man stepped inside, his face a mask of professional calm. "Mr. Chen," the man said, his voice clipped and respectful. "The board is waiting for you." Lu Wen nodded stiffly, the motion feeling unnatural, like he was trying to fit into a suit that didn't quite belong. He followed the man down the corridor, past rows of glass-walled offices, until they reached the conference room. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him as he entered, the room falling silent as he took his seat at the head of the long, polished table. There was a moment of tension in the air, a collective exhale as the others settled into their seats, awaiting his direction. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to be the one making the decisions. But all Lu Wen could think of was the voice in his head, the one that had become his constant companion since the moment he'd entered this body. That he looked around the room at the faces of the board members. They were waiting. Their eyes were trained on him, eager for his approval, his command. And in that moment, Lu Wen realized that this was his world now. The power, the prestige, everything he had once thought was out of his reach was now within his grasp. But at what cost? "Mr. Chen," one of the board members said, his voice breaking the silence. "Shall we begin?" Lu Wen nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. He glanced at the agenda in front of him, the neatly typed lines detailing decisions to be made, investments to approve, acquisitions to consider. This was Chen Chang's life. Every decision here had consequences that reached far beyond the walls of this room. Lu Wen had no idea what he was doing, but he couldn't let them see that. He couldn't let them see that he was an imposter. "Let's begin," Lu Wen said, his voice steady, calm. He hated how natural the words felt as they passed his lips. As the meeting progressed, Lu Wen found himself going through the motions, listening to the proposals, nodding at the right moments, signing the necessary documents. But inside, his mind was racing. Every word, every decision, felt like it belonged to someone else. He was pretending to be someone he wasn't, and it was suffocating. And then, during a pause in the conversation, the voice spoke again, sharper now, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. "Stop it. You're killing me. You're killing us. You have to let me go. I can't stay in here much longer. I'm losing myself." Lu Wen felt a pang of guilt, a tightening in his chest. What had he done? What was he supposed to do? Help the man, free him from his own body, or continue living the life that had been forced upon him? His hand shook as he picked up the pen to sign another document. He had to make a decision. He had to break free, one way or another. After what felt like hours, the meeting finally ended, the board members filtering out of the room, leaving Lu Wen alone with his thoughts. He sat there, staring at the pile of papers before him, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. The voice had gone quiet for now, but Lu Wen knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Chen Chang was still in his head, still pleading for release. That he couldn't do this forever. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. But what did that even mean? If he helped Chen Chang escape, would he be freeing himself, or would he simply become the next ghost, trapped in a body that wasn't his? His mind spun as he stood up, pacing the room. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't keep playing this role. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to fix this. His gaze landed on the mirror again. The mirror. The source of all of this. The thing that had pulled him into this nightmare in the first place. Could it be the key to his freedom? The next day, Lu Wen found himself back at the antique shop, the one where he had bought the mirror. It was a different day, a different world now. The shop was as cluttered as before, but today, it felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The old woman was behind the counter again, her gray hair tangled and wild, her eyes sharp despite her age. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Lu Wen didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find here. Answers, maybe. A way out. A way to fix everything. How do I get out? He asked, his voice strained. The old woman met his gaze, her eyes unervingly wise. You've already been given the choice, she said. But there's a cost to everything. The question is, what are you willing to pay? Lu Wen's heart sank. He had known this wasn't going to be easy. I want to go back, he said, his voice desperate. I want to return to my life. She tilted her head, studying him for a long moment. Your life, she repeated, as though testing the words in her mouth. The life you had before? Or the one you've become? Lu Wen faltered. The question had been simple, but the answer wasn't. He wasn't the same person anymore. He could feel it in his bones, in the way he thought, the way he acted. He was no longer the same man who had walked into this shop days ago. The question is, the old woman said, her voice soft but full of weight, who do you want to be? The man who was given a second chance, or the man who took someone else's? Lu Wen stood there, the words settling into his mind like stones in a deep well. The mirror, the body, the voice, they had all been part of something much larger than he could have ever understood, but now, he was faced with a decision. A choice. Would he fight for the life he had, or let it go to free another soul?